Hello, everyone. This is the designer's commentary for the Pastores, a supplement for Cthulhu Dark Ages. I am Tom DeMeo, and I am the author. Cthulhu Dark Ages, for those of you who don't know, is a horror role playing game set in medieval Europe. It basically takes the Cthulhu mythos of H.P. Lovecraft and changes the setting to a medieval setting so that players are now confronting the eldritch horrors of the universe with nothing more than a sharp sword and a torch compared to normal Call of Cthulhu where you're confronting the eldritch horrors of the universe with, I don't know, an electric flashlight and a revolver. Not very effective either way. But at any rate, the Pastores was originally a Miskatonic University monograph publication that I guess is over 15 years ago now that I wrote in grad school while I was working on my PhD in medieval history. So it was basically a write up of one of my house campaigns. And uh, the production quality at the time was basically it was black and white. I ended up having to do most of the illustrations myself, and I'm not all that great an artist. And so uh, now I've had the opportunity to revise it for the new Miskatonic Repository program. And sort of amateur publishing and desktop publishing has come a long way uh, since I did the original Pastores. And so the new book, I think, is just uh, very attractive, uh, much more visually appealing than the old one. So, as a supplement, it's about 80 pages and it details a particular cult, the uh, Pastores, who were active in uh, basically early medieval France, in the sort of post Charlemagne uh, centuries. And then there are a series of scenarios that are designed to sort of introduce the pastores and uh, form a kind of a little mini campaign. It's but then it's open ended so that the keeper can end it sort of however they want and uh, with as much or as little focus on the actual pastores as they'd like to do. So the main thing I was trying to do when I wrote the pastores is to show kind of what the worldview of one of these mythos cults would be, and to kind of emphasize that they would not have thought of themselves as like a mythos cult. That this particular organization combines a kind of medieval Christian worldview with elements of Lovecraft's mythos, but they don't really distinguish between, kind of the ordinary earthly uh, religion and the sort of the cosmically true and awful Lovecraftian uh, mythos and its implications for the wider universe. That they're, in other words, that they're basically into religious syncretism between these elements. And the Pastores are a basically a Shub-Niggurath cult. They worship Lovecraft's sort of vegetative fertility deity. And they then blend this with elements of like ancient Mediterranean and Roman religion, like the cult of Attis, elements of Christianity, for example, Christ's Passion, and the importance of the Virgin Mary. Uh, they are in sort of the Lovecraftian mythos. They are interested in various kinds of bodily transformations and kind of accumulating worldly power. They are kind of a family organization. There are a couple of main noble families of the Pastores that have different castles and fortifications. And in the areas under their control, they're interested in breeding various kinds of quasi human creatures. The big inspirations here were Lovecraft's Rats in the Walls and the PC Ghost wrote called The Mound. And in both of them, there are societies that are essentially uh, breeding humans into animal-like creatures, like the uh, sort of monstrous mounts, kind of like horses that you get in the Mound. And in the Rats in the Walls, basically this medieval family uh, was involved in like growing humans to be meat food animals. You can see some of Lovecraft's sort of obsessions here, and a kind of a body horror and horror of ancestry and so forth that he does. And so the Pastores then are interested in transforming kind of the people, the peasantry under their rule, and themselves using various techniques to kind of enchant and improve their own bodies. The main thing I wanted to do with the revision is I wanted to make the book look better. So I got a friend of mine, Prior Locuson, to redo my cover in full color. And I drew on a variety of basically copyright-free, open source images of medieval art and incorporated it into the book. I also did some revision this time. I added a number of organizations for the player characters to be part of. When I ran my original playtest, I noticed that my players who are kind of on the liberal end of politics, seemed to be pretty uncomfortable playing as basically enforcers of medieval Catholic orthodoxy, which is kind of how the Cthulhu: The Dark Ages organization, the Order of the Sword of Saint Jerome, was set up back in the first edition. So I decided to add, in addition to kind of ecclesiastical organizations they could work for, to add basically a noble, so they could be more on the aristocratic side of things, and basically a kind of a hedge magician. One of the things that I studied was medieval clerical magicians. There was a kind of in the real world, there was a kind of an underground group of clerics who also did magic for clients, and we have a number of their actual books that they wrote with spells and philosophies and things in them. And so we know they were around. So I made another organization sort of based around them, and then a final organization based around Norse magicians. I'm really into the Viking Age, and the Vikings had a kind of an interesting complex of ideas about magic and the kind of the projected soul and shape shifting in things like Sather, which is a historical term for a kind of magic that they used. We're not entirely sure what it involved. Gulder, which was spoken magic, and berserkering and shape shifting were strongly connected to this as well. So I made another organization that was basically a Norse family that kind of showed each of these aspects. So that's the other big revision to the text that occurred is was largely because of the copyright issues involved in the new Miskatonic repository. The monographs, they were published by Chaosium itself, and so they basically could take advantage of all of the different licensing agreements that Chaosium has with sort of post-Lovecraft mythos authors and their estates. The repository, we are all sort of theoretically independent authors, and so we can't really draw on a lot of that material that is out of the public domain and is not part of the Miskatonic license. So I had to do some changes to some of the text, and the original had a really sort of kind of big kind of intertextual game of tagging different things in the Cthulhu mythos and bringing them all together, which I thought that fans of the mythos and of Call of Cthulhu would kind of get a kick out of. But in this edition, I had to drop a lot of that. In particular, it was not possible to use the Dark Young of Shub-Niggurath, which is a classic monster, and I had a lot about Seth Agua in the original one, and his connections to Gaspard de Nord and some other kinds of like in sort of intellect, literary references to the mythos. I like Ramsey Campbell's Moonlands was particularly missed when I had to do the revision. But in some ways, I think it's better. Most of the monsters now, instead of being identifiable monsters from Call of Cthulhu and the Cthulhu mythos, that players are going to could recognize and tie to sort of the larger world of the mythos, are now these mysterious things that don't have a good explanation exactly for why they're there, and so they're sort of unique and horrifying in unique and awful ways that is more like the experience an actual person might have with the mythos in this setting. The actual player characters aren't going to have much of a clue at all about any of this. And so in some ways, I think that worked out better. As I said, the main thing I wanted to do with this book was to improve the aesthetics. So I already mentioned the cover by my friend Prior Locuson. And I then also drew upon elements from actual medieval art. One of the things that I love about Call of Cthulhu, the Dark Ages, is that it really is set in the Dark Ages. It is set in the early part of the Middle Ages, before a lot of the classic elements that we associate with the Middle Ages come into existence. Things like knights and jousting and big stone castles, and all of that is really a product of a kind of a later period, a sort of high medieval boom time, starting around the middle of the 11th century, in which medieval Europe gets much better infrastructure and a bigger population and more robust institutions and so forth. So it's there's no chivalry, there's no uh, castles and big castles and soaring cathedrals. You've got a bunch of kind of grubby guys in chainmail uh, living in sort of the countryside without a lot of the things we would associate with the later Middle Ages, like full plate armor, um, or some of the other technology from the later part of the Middle Ages. And I really especially like the new edition of Cthulhu Dark Ages. Not only kind of takes this Dark Age period, which is a kind of a nickname for the period right after the end of the Roman Empire, or all the way up to about the turn of the millennium, that it picks Anglo-Saxon England, which is itself an even more sort of unique and flavorful location in the early medieval / Viking Age period. Um, the British Isles get invaded by Vikings who set up a number of towns and kind of sub kingdoms. So there's that interchange between the Old Norse and the Old English populations in their language and institutions and wars and so forth. And so, and it's still recognizably very English. And so it's got that kind of familiar strangeness that's really kind of and kind of part of its charm, and it's the vocabulary of Old English um, kind of comes through as well. So one of the things I wanted to do when I was working on it is to bring in pieces of art kind of from that period. And again, a lot of the art that we associate with the Middle Ages is from later periods. So let me bring this up here. If you look here, this is the cover image, which I've mentioned before, and it is designed to evoke a kind of a Byzantine art style. Great big googly eyes on people, and has some elements of sort of Mary's iconography in the kind of blue mantle and the static kind of stiff Byzantine pose with the use of essentially gold foil. And so Prior said he was really had a good time doing this because it kind of got to imitate art historical styles. And then I supplemented that with pictures of art and architecture actually from this period. Here you can see this is the interior of a church, and I pulled art and architecture out of the public domain images on Wikipedia and Wikimedia, basically from essentially the Carolingian period up through, I guess, the kind of Ottonian period, particularly architecture like this and manuscript illustrations. Here's this is a carved ivory. Here's one of the manuscript illustrations I'm talking about here. I gave it this sort of fake parchment background. I know it's maybe a little bit hokey, but I wanted it to look a bit like a medieval book as well. And so for the headings and titles, I used a font that's basically built on minuscule and majuscule letters from the period. The really pointy letters, like you get, I think there's like a big capital in the back of Cthulhu Dark Ages cover that is basically a Gothic letter, or sometimes called black letter or fraktur, was again a later medieval hand. And so I wanted to go back and use something that was redolent of the older style of handwriting and script. So as you can see, I did a lot of manuscript illustrations, used a lot of those. We've also got some of my original images, which I think actually look a lot better in this setting, with some more colorful stuff around them. Although you can tell I'm still not the world's greatest artist here. And I wish I'd had the funds and the time to have most of these things recommissioned, but I did not. The other main element I'm using is these Viking designs by Jonas Markusson. He had a website up that basically looks at all the Old Norse, essentially designs and styles going through the Viking Age and their various evolutions, and they're all vector graphics. So I purchased a license to use those. Like I said, I'm a real sucker for Viking art. And I have basically the original maps that I did as well. So here you can see this is another ivory. This piece over here is a manuscript illustration. The manuscripts of the Last Judgment and the Afterlife and the Apocalypse proved kind of particularly apt for Call of Cthulhu illustrations. Here's another of the Viking designs here. And as I said, this was originally my house campaign when I was in grad school. I studied, I guess still study, mostly the high medieval period and some of its ideas about magic and the supernatural. I had this one instance. I was got a microfiche of a medieval manuscript of, I think it was a Liber Socratus, which is medieval magical text. I'm down in the basement of the library in this big cinder block room with basically no windows, and I've got this microfiche, or microfilm or whatever, projecting up these manuscript pages with like designs and things on them, and it's in Latin. I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh no, I'm a Call of Cthulhu character, aren't I? So my joke is that I actually have a degree in medieval metaphysics, which that's not actually what the degree is in. It's in history, but that is pretty much what I studied. So there's a kind of circularity in that, and I drew on some of my interests in medieval syncretism and dissidence and heresy in writing the Pastores. Now, the actual early Middle Ages, when the Pastores is set, did not have a whole lot of basically internal dissenting Christian groups in Western Europe, like they did in the High Middle Ages. In the High Middle Ages, you start seeing groups like the Waldensians and the Cathars that are essentially organized underground religious movements. You don't get a lot of that in the early Middle Ages. They don't. I think a lot of it is that they don't have the infrastructure to really go out and look for people who have differing ideas, and they don't really have a lot of energy that they want to spend on suppressing them either. But by the time you get to the high medieval period with its economic boom time and whatever, you've got a whole lot of religious dissidents and protests. And one of the more interesting groups from that period is the Cathars. The Cathars, sometimes called the Albigensians, were a really quite strange group in terms of their theology. It's quite a bit different than mainstream Christianity. They were dualists, possibly related to the Manichees or the Zoroastrians. But basically, the idea is that the world is the creation of an evil God, and that the good God is trying to free souls from the evil material realm. And so they interpret the incarnation of Christ and baptism as basically that Jesus' mission was to allow human souls to escape a cycle of reincarnation here on earth in this evil, polluted material realm. So in some ways, it's almost kind of Buddhist. Um, but the Cathars spread their ideas through a network of preachers, and they were also through the nobility of southern France. They some of the families sponsored like Cathar holy people and kind of quasi monastic establishments. And so they had a pretty good foothold in the southern French nobility. So much so, in fact, that the Pope ends up actually calling a crusade against them and sending in the sort of northern Frankish nobility and warriors to like suppress them and take over a lot of the southern French positions, nobles, in order to basically be able to conduct a thorough investigation of and eradication of these different ideas, which is pretty successful. The Cathars were basically then more or less ceased to exist, although other heresies and dissident groups continued. So I drew on a lot of that with the Pastores, who, again, are spreading primarily through family networks as the nobility. And they have a theology that's very different than a lot of the Catholics around them, but is superficially similar. And so in some ways they can kind of hide in plain sight, and they will have iconography and stories and preaching that have a kind of a mythos twist to them, but might not appear to be impious or heretical to a kind of a casual or uneducated observer. And that was another part of the sort of feel of things that I wanted to capture with the Pastores. And so I think the Cathars were in some ways a kind of a model for how a medieval cult like the Pastores might operate. So overall, I am quite pleased with the revision. And I think it looks tremendously better. I think parts of it may read better as well. And I think it's definitely more physically attractive. When I got the proofs, my wife says, "Oh, that's gorgeous." And a lot of the early medieval art, the manuscript illustrations and things, they really are gorgeous. They're beautiful art, and they are fitted to the time period, which is kind of what I was trying to do with the book overall. There's a lot of body horror in the book. People changing shape or mutating or whatever. There's one scenario where there's this magic fruit that the player characters might or might not want to partake of, but which certainly got going a theme in my group about do not eat the mythos artifact. Became a kind of a, what do I want to say, motto of my different campaigns when I was running them. So I hope you check out the Pastores, which is available in print and as a PDF from the Miskatonic repository. And I hope you enjoyed this commentary. And if you want to send me any questions or whatever, you can send them to thomas.demayo@gmail.com.